talk to us. Sorry.
Sorry, I was just setting up live on YouTube. I was talking to a colleague. All right.
Sorry.
No, you're so fine. That was very confusing on my part. All right, we are live on YouTube, so we can get started. I'm gonna just go ahead. Sorry, I was just setting up live on YouTube. I was talking to a colleague. All right. Oh, fine. That was. Oh, sorry. I don't know what's happening. Get started. I'm gonna just go. Okay, technical difficulties. Sorry about the YouTube echo. All right, we will get started now. I don't think I have anyone else from Bullitt or Henry County here, do I? All right, we'll get started. Okay, so I'm just gonna give a brief presentation. This is very conversational. If you have any thoughts or comments throughout, feel free to interject. And we'll have a couple polls throughout too, just for engagement. So 1 second. All right, so today we're going to be talking about the risk assessment for the hazard mitigation plan. So for those of you that weren't at our last meeting or that need a refresher, we're just going to go do a quick overview of the hazard mitigation plan. So again, this is required for communities under the Stafford Act of 2001. And it's federally required so that our communities are eligible for FEMA grants. And essentially what hazard mitigation plans do is they assess the likelihood that a natural disaster will occur and formulate how each of our communities will prepare. And we do our hazard mitigation plan at the regional level. And that's because, as we know, most hazards don't respect county and city boundaries. And so our regional plan includes Bullitt, Henry, Oldham, Shelby, Spencer, and Trimble counties. And Jefferson County does their own thing, as they do a lot. And then what comes out of this is a series of mitigation projects that will be eligible for FEMA funding for our counties and communities. And we update the plan every 5 years. So our last update was in 2016. And so again, most importantly, this makes our communities eligible for FEMA funding. So we're working on our 2021 update and hope to have this finished by this fall of 2021, give or take another pandemic or disaster. All right, sorry, my computer is pausing. 1 second. All right, so when I'm talking about hazards, what am I specifically speaking about? So these are the hazards that are covered in our hazard mitigation plan. So anything from dam failure to landslides, to floods, to extreme temperatures, to earthquakes, anything that has happened here or could happen here in terms of natural disasters. We'll also be covering pandemics in our upcoming plan as well, just because that's seen to be increasingly pertinent. So I'm just going to put out a poll. And this should, let's see how this will work. All right, I'm launching a poll. If everyone could vote, this is what hazard are you most concerned about for your community? I'll just give everyone a minute or so to respond.
Hey, Olivia, I'm getting a message that hosts and panelists cannot vote. If we're all panelists, this may be an issue.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Well, I don't know how to solve that right now. So we will just end the poll And we'll come back to that once I figured it out. I'm not sure why it's not sharing with everyone. Okay. I might relaunch that later. Go back to the presentation. Again, my apologies. All right. Okay. It's our first poll. Okay. So what does hazard mitigation look like? And what are we talking about when we say mitigation? So mitigation in our communities looks like tornado warning systems, burying utilities, wind-resistant building practices, home buyouts, retention basins, having elevation requirements for our communities. Those are just some examples of what mitigation looks like. The point of mitigation is to lessen the impact of a natural disaster. Obviously, we can't stop natural disasters, but the point is to lessen the impact and to make our communities more prepared. All right. So the major components of our hazard mitigation plan are the risk assessment and the mitigation strategy. And so today we're going to be talking about the risk assessment. So the risk assessment, what that does is it essentially describes hazards, it identifies important community pieces of infrastructure and assets, it analyzes risk, and it summarizes our community's vulnerability. And the mitigation strategy is in response to that, and it comes up with a series of goals and potential actions and projects for our communities to address these risks. So what does a risk assessment look like? That's what we're talking about today. So there's about 5 parts to a risk assessment. The first part is pretty basic. It is our hazard identification. So essentially what this does is it looks at which hazard are we talking about? Where do these hazards happen typically? How do you measure the hazard? Is it in acres? Is it in the enhanced Fujita scale for tornadoes? How do you measure its magnitude? And that goes to extent. And then we go into the history of the hazard events. So where have previous events occurred in the region? And then what damage did they cause? And for some of our hazards, they haven't necessarily occurred in the past 20 or even 50 years. However, if they did occur, it would be a catastrophic event. But again, this is the history of hazards. And then that goes into the probability of a future event. So what is the likelihood of this event happening again? And can this occurrence be annualized? So if a hazard has occurred, say, 10 times on average per year for the last 10 years, that's an annualized occurrence. Then also, is it a rare but catastrophic event? Is it going to cause major mayhem, but it doesn't happen often? So we look into the occurrence, we look into vulnerability, and then we also look into how the changing climate can impact the probability of this event. And so then the impacts of the hazard. So how can the hazard impact critical infrastructure? So those are critical pieces of our infrastructure being water and wastewater systems, our schools, our police stations, our city and government buildings, our hospitals. What impact can it have? And how can the hazard impact people and communities? How can it impact agriculture? And what will the cost the community will have to bear be? So that's looking at the impacts of the hazard. And then kind of the last part of the risk assessment is vulnerability. So are certain populations more vulnerable to the hazard? Are certain buildings and building types more vulnerable? Like when a building is in a floodplain, it's definitely more vulnerable to flooding. Are there any additional factors that make a group of people or property more vulnerable? So we're just going to I'm going to go briefly through each of our hazards and talk about how our risk assessment is coming thus far. Myself and our GIS analyst, Anne-Marie, have been working on this, and it's not fully complete, but it gives you kind of an overview of what information we've collected so far. So first, we'll talk about dam failure. So when we're talking about dam failure, that can be caused by a hydraulic failure, a seepage failure, or a structural failure. We don't have any history of dam failure happening really in our KIPTA counties. There was a dam malfunction about almost 25 years ago at the Geist Creek Lake Dam in Spencer County, but it didn't really cause any serious damage or property damage. So we haven't had a major dam failure event in the KIPTA region. And so the probability of a future event, we don't have an annualized occurrence. We don't know how often it'll happen per year because, again, this doesn't happen often. But also, all right. Also leading into that, if we're looking at a changing climate, increasing precipitation can lead to greater dam failure because of flooding. So that's possible in the future. So that could impact the probability of a future dam failure event. And the major impacts of dam failure are property and infrastructure damage and potentially in extreme cases, injuries and death. So our vulnerability in the KIPTA region kind of depends. So if we have community members and property and infrastructure that's located close to a dam, it is more vulnerable to dam failure. Also, our dams vary in hazard class, meaning their potential impact. So some are more hazardous than others. And this can be particularly difficult. And then finally, with our regulations and emergency plans, some dams have emergency plans in place, which make them less vulnerable to an event happening, and they're able to mitigate an event when it happens, and some don't, and that can make a dam or dam failure more likely. All right, so our next slide, we're going to talk about drought. And drought, again, is this prolonged period of precipitation deficiency. And then the history of drought in the KIPTA region, we don't actually have any recorded major drought events in our NOAA database in the past 50 years. However, the Kentucky Energy and Environment Cabinet declared a level 1 drought for the entire state, including our KIPTA counties in September 2019. Level 1 drought is kind of like the most basic level of drought. It's not too intense. It just means that it has been long enough to realize that there is some sort of precipitation deficiency. And so the probability of this happening in the future, it's kind of unclear about that, especially since we don't have any annualized events for drought. And it's unclear how drought is impacted by a changing climate. And then major impacts of drought. Drought's impacts, and this will be in our hazard mitigation plan, are mostly on our water supply and our agriculture. And for vulnerability, what we've done and what Anne-Marie has put together is a soil susceptibility index, which means which soils and which areas are more vulnerable to drought based on their soil composition. Because again, the biggest impact of drought is on agriculture. All right, so then our next one is earthquake. We measure earthquake, of course, with the Richter scale or the modified Mercalli scale. And then the kind of the history of earthquakes is in 2015, we had a 2.7 magnitude earthquake in Shelby County, but there was no reported damage or injuries. So that's kind of our history of earthquakes. It's not a common event here in the KIPTA region. The probability of a future occurrence, we don't have any annualized occurrence data for earthquakes, and there's no clear impact from a changing climate or how climate change will impact earthquakes. So that's pretty unclear. And then major impacts of earthquakes are property and infrastructure damage, of course, and injuries and death. And vulnerability to earthquakes is based on one's proximity to fault lines. Everyone is essentially equally vulnerable typically to earthquakes. And then we're going to talk about extreme temperatures. So extreme heat is when temperatures are substantially hotter and more intense than average, and humidity is more intense. And history, we are currently compiling all extreme heat warnings and watches for the KIPTA region, and that will speak to the history of extreme heat events. Probability of future heat events. High heat and high humidity are expected to increase with a changing climate, which is very concerning. And so that's definitely something we want to prepare for. And the major impacts of extreme heat are health impacts. So that's hyperthermia, that's heat stroke, that's an uptick in electricity use because people are using more air condition. Extreme heat because of high humidity and high heat has an impact on our air quality as well. And then the most vulnerable are actually children and older adults because heat has a bigger impact on their bodies, and also low-income persons who may not have access to air-conditioned facilities. So we have a specific vulnerability there. And then leading from extreme heat, we go to extreme cold. So as you would assume, extreme cold is temperatures that are substantially colder than average. And our history here, we're currently compiling all extreme cold warnings and watches. The probability of extreme cold in the future right now is unclear. It's unclear how climate change is going to impact our number of extreme cold events. And then the major impacts of extreme cold are health impacts, just like extreme heat. So we are looking at hypothermia and frostbite, also an uptick in electricity use, as we saw in Texas this year, where more people are using their heaters and natural gas during cold spells. And then also major impacts are bursting pipes and impacts on the water system. And the same vulnerability goes back here. Children and older adults are particularly vulnerable to extreme cold temperatures, especially low-income people who may not have access to or pay for heating. And then also unhoused people, so homeless people, are especially vulnerable to extremely cold temperatures. And then hail. Hail is rated on the Toro hail scale. So there's a magnitude rating for hail. In the past, we've had about 179 hail events in the Kipta region between 2000 and 2020. And according to NOAA, that resulted in about $238,000 in property damage. So that leads to about, on an annual basis, about 9 hail events on average in the Kipta region per year, with an annualized loss of about 11,900. And it is, however, unclear how the changing climate is going to impact hail events. The major impacts of hail are, of course, property and roof damage and crop damage. And there's no specific vulnerable group or area to hail. All right, and then we look at flood. There's 3 major types of flooding. There's like 7 total types of flooding, but mostly what we're looking at is regional flooding, riverine flooding, and flash flooding. And so the history of flooding in our region, from 2000 to 2020, we had about 169 heavy rain and flood events, which resulted in about almost $3 million in property damage, according to NOAA. I also needed to gather FEMA statistics on this as well. So the probability of a flood happening every year, there's about 14 flooding events on average per year in the Kipta region. So it's one of our top hazards, and that's led to an annualized loss, and a yearly loss of about $143,000. And the probability of floods is only increasing as heavy precipitation is expected to increase in coming years due to climate change. So it's kind of only intensifying. And then major impacts of floods are property and infrastructure damage. And then, of course, health impacts from water contamination, which flooding can lead to. And then vulnerable groups, older adults and those with disabilities who maybe can't leave their home or property are particularly vulnerable. Low-income communities are more likely to live in floodplains. So they're particularly vulnerable. And then, of course, buildings and infrastructure in floodplains. And then sinkholes, everyone's favorite natural hazard. For sinkholes, we're looking at the extent and in its diameter. History, so this is based on the Kentucky Geological Survey's data. We have about 1,600 topo sinkholes are projected. So it's hard to keep track sinkholes, and it's hard to know when sinkholes happen. And so a lot of this is projected and LiDAR data. So we're looking at about almost 2,000 topo sinkholes, and then about 5,000 LiDAR sinkholes are projected. The probability of a future event, probability of a future sinkhole, depends on our karst potential. We have a karst potential map for y'all. So if there's greater karst potential, a sinkhole is more likely to occur. It's unclear how climate change impacts sinkholes at this time. Some major impacts of hazards, so karst topography and can impact groundwater, natural gas lines, and underground utilities. There's no specific vulnerable group to karst or sinkhole. All right, and then landslides. What we have here is a landslide confidence ranking to identify the confidence level that a landslide has occurred in the past. Right now, the map that we have shows 38 landslide locations with varying levels of confidence. That means that some of our landslides we're very confident have happened, and then some of them we are not as confident have occurred. But about 38, almost 40. Landslides, because of increased precipitation that's expected with a changing climate and a disturbed slope elevation, increase the likelihood of landslides in the future. Of course, the major impacts of landslides are on roads, highways, and infrastructure. I'm from Nashville, and we had a major kind of landslide on one of our highways about a year ago, and it shut down the highway for quite some time. So landslides can have a huge impact. And of course, in extreme circumstances, they can lead to injuries and death. For vulnerability, there are not any specific groups that are vulnerable to landslides. All right, for severe storms, so these are like thunderstorms with intense winds and hail. We've had about 720 events that have included either a tornado or high winds or hail in the past 20 years in the Kipta region, which has led to about $4 million in property damage. So that leads to an annual loss of about $200,000. The climate impact on severe thunderstorms and winds is unclear at this time. So we don't know what that looks like going forward. And major impacts of severe storm are property and infrastructure damage, of course, and injuries and death. Those who are particularly vulnerable are unsheltered people who would be out in the storm. And then we've got tornadoes. So tornadoes, we measure that on the enhanced Fujita scale, which are F0s to F5s. We have about 63 events between 1950 and 2020, and those vary in size. Some of those are very small, insignificant tornadoes, and some are more substantial. So because of that, the probability of a tornado happening every year, they're about 0.9, not quite one event per year on average. It's unknown how climate change is going to affect tornadoes at this time. Major impacts of tornadoes, of course, are property and infrastructure damage and injuries and death. Those who are increasingly vulnerable are homeless folks, as well as mobile homes and homes without strong building properties as well. But mobile homes is specifically one thing we'll be looking into, because mobile home parks are particularly vulnerable to greater tornado damage. All right, wildfires. Okay, so wildfires, we measure this through the number of acres burned. There have been about 170 wildfire events between 2000 and 2020 in the Kipta region, which resulted in around 1,100 acres burned. You should note about this is the 170 events. Some of those are very small localized events where it's maybe like an acre. And we did have one big wildfire in Bullitt County in, I want to say 2015, that resulted in about 200 acres. I have it on my map, but they vary in size. So when we say 170 events, that could have just been an acre or even half an acre. So the probability of a future wildfire, so that's about 8 events on average per year, which could be substantial, but again, a lot of these wildfires are pretty small. And the major impacts of wildfires are, of course, property and infrastructure damage. They can lead to power outages, injuries, and death, and they can also have an impact on our air quality as well. The most vulnerable to wildfires are where new development meets rural areas, which creates this wildland-urban interface. Those areas are the most vulnerable to wildfires. And then the populations that are most vulnerable to wildfires are those with asthma or COPD or any sort of breathing problem. All right, so did we miss anything? Were there any events that I haven't covered? Anyone have any questions thus far? Okay, awesome. But that's why we need localized knowledge, because we, Emery and I have been working on collecting state and national data, but that's not always the most robust data, and you might have better data for your community or more information on smaller events that have occurred. So that's really important that we get that information from you.
Olivia, Jim has a question.
Oh, okay.
I got actually a question and a comment. First of all, we actually have an active sinkhole in Oldham County.
Okay.
It's a major one. It's huge. And how do we report that, or how do you collect that information?
So I was gonna say Kentucky Geological Survey is the source where we got the sinkhole data, and the contour developed ones were mapped sinkholes that were on the old topographic maps. And then the LIDAR developed ones are ones that they've used an automated methodology to draw areas where there are likely to be sinkholes based on our elevation data that the state has collected.
Yeah,
but Kentucky Geological Survey would be who to reach out to.
What I'm asking is, how do we report a sinkhole to be part of this collected
data?
Yeah,
so that
because
is
it's, hang on, sorry, because it's affecting a roadway. So we
sure.
have a sinkhole that has now affected a roadway, and it's a major thing. And is it something that we want to report in some way, or how do we collect that, or how are you collecting that as part of our hazard mitigation plan?
Yeah. I'd love to email with you about this after the meeting and figure out how we should proceed, because that's not something that we've done yet.
Yeah.
We also have, Jim, we have our feedback map, which I would love for you to use. Let me just get out of my full screen view. So on our website, if you go to, it's kiptahazardmitigation.org. If you go to our feedback map, this is where you can put the sinkhole in. You can add a comment. So we've had a lot of comments about flooding from Shelby County, but you can go to Oldham County, press submit a report, and select a category. So this would be another hazard issue, sinkhole, and then simply put the address or find it on the map and then press report it. So then that goes into our files for data on these hazards.
Okay. I have a question about the annualized cost and how you get that. I know that you have a range of 2000 to 2020, and there's X amount of events, but especially in the relation to the cost of a flood, and I know it's annualized, that number of 143,000, I was like, well, any flood creates, certainly in one house, could be 143,000. I don't know how that annualized cost was calculated.
Yeah, and that is a preliminary annualized cost, and I should have phrased that better. I need to still collect data from FEMA. That was the NOAA annualized cost. So I'm still developing a full annualized cost for flooding. And so I'll make that available. That was a preliminary estimate based on NOAA data.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Thanks for the questions. Keep them coming. Everyone's so excited about hazards and natural disasters, aren't we? Such a fun topic. All right.
I just want to pop in. Sorry, Olivia, to interrupt, but like Jim, like she was just getting into the localized data. It is very important that you and other local officials and other people within Oldham County utilize this feedback map for us and pinpoint some specific localized data, that we just wouldn't be able to have access to otherwise. You all have that data and have that information. And we really want to do a better job at pulling in that localized data this year. And then we get very specific, identifying projects connected to these specific localized points that you're all identifying that we're missing out on otherwise, for the purposes of potentially getting funding for that specific identified example that you pull through there. So just to reiterate the importance of you participating with the feedback map, that'd be great.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're looking for from all of our communities. Shelby County has done an incredible job. I would like to give a shout out to Craig Myatt, because he's gone through and he's put in a ton of flash flooding events that we didn't have in our records that were some localized knowledge from the road department. So that's what we're looking for, because again, the records that we have aren't complete. They're state and national data. And so the more that y'all can offer us, the better our plan's going to be and the better we can do at estimating, annualized events and annualized costs to our communities. Awesome. All right. So speaking of that, I'm just going to quickly go through the website again. For those of y'all that aren't familiar, we've actually done some major updates since we last spoke in November. It's been quite some time. And so I wanted to go through those really quickly just to show y'all and to show y'all what we have available. So for example, if you go to dam failure, just such a fun topic. We've developed these different interfaces through Tableau, and you can look and see which dams are in your county. So say I want to look at Oldham County. I'll search Oldham County. It will show me on the map where these dams are located in Oldham County, and then also what their hazard class is, which hazard class means the likelihood of a major impact or failure. And you can even look in, you can search an address, search the map. You can zoom in. These are streets. You can even zoom in really far, see exactly where it's located. So that's something helpful that we've developed for our communities. And again, it's customizable to your county. And so that's great. And then we also, for all of these tables and interfaces, we have a data table. And this is where you can download all of the data that we have available. And you simply press download PDF. And then you can download all of Oldham County's information. So that's a pretty easy way to do it. We've done that for as many hazards as we can. Anne-Marie's been great about getting us data for that. So for example, we've done it for, let's see, tornadoes. It's another example. So these are the tornado locations from 1950 to 2020. And you can hover over these locations and see information about when they occurred and where they occurred and how many deaths happened or how many injuries happened and what scale, where it ranked in terms of magnitude. And you can customize it by county again. So say, let's go to Bullitt County. And then you can see, okay, there have been 10 tornadoes since 1950 in Bullitt County, 24 injuries associated with these tornadoes and 0 deaths. So you can go by county on this list, which is pretty cool. And again, we have another one of those data tables where you can just download that information for your community. And then we have that for many of our hazards. We also have different maps as well that lend themselves to a different format. So for example, this is the map of our sinkholes in the Kipta region. And these are kind of projected sinkholes. And you can see them here, which is pretty cool. And you can zoom into your community. So that's some great information that we have on our website that's been updated since November. It's going to continue to be updated as we gather more information. So that's just a good resource that I want y'all to continue to use. We've developed it specifically for communicating during COVID. And then again, we just talked about the feedback map, but we've only had 12 survey responses thus far. We really want y'all's thoughts on our initial survey. So please take that. That's on our website as well. If you have any questions about the website or see any issues, my information is right at the bottom of the website. And again, that's kiptahazardmitigation.org. So just as a reminder that we have that available. And then looking at the hours. So as many of you know, we have an hours requirement, an in-kind hours requirement for our communities, which is about 90 hours per community that we need to get finished by the fall of this year. So this is a list of how many hours we have from each county thus far. Unfortunately, any time from people who are paid through federal funds, such as emergency managers, cannot count towards our hours. So these are an approximate estimate of the hours that we've received thus far. I've been attending county meetings as well as LEPC meetings and city council meetings. So right now Shelby County has almost 30 hours, but then we have some counties that don't quite even have 10 hours yet. So I'll be looking for ways to increase those numbers. And so please respond to my emails and calls because we need 90 hours from each community by this fall in order to pay for this plan. Again, we do this plan essentially for free. We used to charge for this plan, but how to pay for this plan now is just through participation. That's why we really need your participation. And I've been going out to cities and counties, and I appreciate my mayor and fiscal court officers' assistance with that. But that's where we stand now.
Olivia, can you say that again about not counting time for emergency managers? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So because this is paid for through the Department of Military Affairs, we can really only count folks who don't receive the majority of their salary from the federal government. So anyone that's receiving, specifically emergency managers that are receiving part of their salary from the federal government, that does not count towards our hours. That's a stipulation that the Department of Military Affairs has.
Okay, but a key word you just said there was majority.
Mm-hmm.
About us who don't receive a majority of our salary from this.
Sorry, I think I misspoke on that. It's kind of confusing, but it's any sort of, I'm trying to remember the exact portion, but if you're receiving federal funding for your position, you're ineligible for hours. Okay. And that's not true for like city or county engineers or public officials or local government officials and employees typically. But for emergency managers, that does apply.
Copy. I got it. Thanks.
Yep. So that's why. So unfortunately, emergency managers obviously know the most about what's going on with disasters typically. And I want to count our time that we talk and that y'all attend my meetings, but I can't. So that's just a stipulation there. All right. Okay, any other questions at this time? All right. So please take the survey before our next meeting, which is going to happen in June, and I'll be sending out an invite for that. As soon as possible, please take our survey. We only have 12 responses thus far. I'll send out all those links again after this meeting has concluded. It's also on our website, kiptahazardmitigation.org. We really want to know your thoughts on how prepared or not prepared your communities are and what you think is the biggest threat disaster-wise to your community. That helps inform our plan and inform our projects, and that's what we're looking for. Also, we are going to have a separate survey for members of the public because we want to know what your community members think about natural disasters and their preparedness. So I'm going to send that survey out. Let me know when I send an email out, let me know who I should get in touch with in regards to posting on social media. I'll send an image or like a JPEG of a post for social media along with the survey link. Again, we're just trying to get public response, which can be increasingly difficult during COVID. We think we need the mitigation action worksheet from Bullitt and Henry counties. I sent that out last week. Everyone else has filled it out thus far. I'll follow up with questions to that as well because it was a bit confusing. We're just trying to figure out what has happened in your communities since our last plan, and what we need to update before we move forward with any sort of goal-making process. Again, going back to the feedback map, please fill out the feedback app, as Danielle said. That gives us this localized knowledge. We wouldn't have known about the sinkhole in Oldham County, so thank you, Jim, for that. And then I'll also be reaching out to schedule one-on-one meetings to discuss mitigation actions as well as any localized issues. So that's going to be happening. Again, major assignment, please take our survey. Please fill out the feedback app. If you're Boulder, Henry County, fill out the mitigation action worksheet. We need to know what you've been up to. And that's about it from me. Do we have any other questions or concerns?
I do have a brief comment to follow up with Olivia on that. Like I said, we would help be able to provide you language and a graphic for you all to use on your all social media to share the survey with the public. This is very important because we have gotten permission to count the public's time spent filling out surveys towards those hours that your community is responsible for participating. So therefore, sharing on social media, sharing on your websites, getting as many community members to participate helps contribute to those hours that you are required to adhere to for your end match requirement. So again, we'll help you craft any sort of social media language or graphic for you to post. So real important. Not only is it just important anyways to get that information from your community, but also it does count towards your time. So be very helpful.
Yep. Awesome. It's very important. We need it. As you can see, we're kind of behind on hours because COVID has put a wrench in things, and we need as much participation as possible. All right. Well, before we close out this meeting, any other comments or questions?
I also just want to say, I want to thank Judge Brent for jumping on today for the meeting. Excited about that. Excited to have Henry County participating. So just a shout out to Judge Brent.
Yes, shout out to Judge Brent. We see you. All right. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for attending. I'll be reaching out with those links, and we'll inquire about social media as well. Again, don't hesitate to reach out to me. You'll have my contact info. All right. Well, thanks everyone.